Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive with us. Today, we're going to be looking at the Indian vice president.
Okay.
Um, a position that I think is often kind of misunderstood,
Yes. Very true.
especially, if you're a UPSC aspirant, this is going to be really important.
Absolutely.
Or really anyone just interested in how India's government works.
Yeah, understanding the structure and the nuances of the role is key.
Yeah, when most people think of the vice president, they think of kind of like a figurehead.
Right.
Someone who shows up to ceremonies and doesn't really have much power.
Yeah,
But our sources actually reveal a much more kind of complex and fascinating picture.
they do. It's a position that is deeply rooted in the Constitution.
Yeah.
And has very unique responsibilities, especially in times of transitions of power.
Right. So let's start with the basics.
Okay.
How is the vice president elected?
Well, the vice president is elected indirectly through a system
Okay.
involving only members of parliament.
Right.
That's both the Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha. It's done through a single transferable vote system, which is something that's very important to understand in detail for the UPSC exam.
Now, our source mentions Dr. B.R. Ambedkar,
Yes.
who is the architect of the Indian Constitution,
Right.
had a very specific reason for excluding the state assemblies from the vice presidential election.
He did. Dr. Ambedkar felt that the president's role, which extends to both central and state administration, requires a broader electoral base, whereas the vice president's role primarily involved presiding over the Rajya Sabha
Right.
and only stepping into the president's shoes in very specific situations.
Interesting. So the thinking was that involving the state assemblies wasn't really necessary?
Right.
Okay, well, that makes me wonder. I mean, were there any unintended consequences of that decision? That's something to think about, I guess.
Definitely.
But for now, let's move on to eligibility.
Okay.
So what does it take to even, dream of becoming the vice president of India?
Well, first and foremost, you have to be an Indian citizen, at least 35 years old and qualified to be a member of the Rajya Sabha.
Okay, pretty standard so far.
Yeah, and then there's an interesting caveat.
Okay.
You can't hold any office of profit under the government.
Office of profit.
Yeah.
That sounds a little vague to me.
It does, doesn't it?
What exactly does that mean? Can you give me an example?
Sure. So imagine a situation where someone is appointed to a government committee
Okay.
and they receive some sort of compensation for it.
Right.
That could be considered an office of profit.
Okay.
But of course, there are exceptions to this rule.
Okay.
So, for example, current presidents, vice presidents, governors, and ministers,
Got it.
they're all exempt from this clause,
Interesting.
even though their roles technically could fall under that definition.
So you meet all the qualifications, you're ready to serve the nation.
Yes.
But before you can even file your nomination, there's a small financial hurdle.
Yes, there is.
A security deposit of $15,000 down. That seems a little low considering the power and the prestige of the office.
It does seem quite symbolic, actually.
Yeah.
Perhaps highlighting that service, not financial gain, should be the primary motivation
Right.
for seeking this high office.
Okay, so we know how they're elected. We know who's eligible to become vice president.
Yes.
But what exactly does the vice president do?
So the Indian vice president has two primary roles.
Okay.
The first one is being the chairman of the Rajya Sabha,
Uh-huh.
and in this role they have quite a lot of power,
Okay.
similar to the speaker of the Lok Sabha.
So they're basically keeping the upper house of parliament in check.
Yes. They preside over the sessions, they maintain order,
Right.
and they ensure that things run smoothly.
Okay, that's a lot of responsibility.
It is, and it gets even more interesting because the vice president
Okay.
also acts as the president of India if there's a vacancy,
Yeah.
or if the president is unable to carry out their duties,
Okay.
whether that be due to illness or absence or any other reason.
So they're kind of like the understudy,
Yes,
ready to step into the lead role if needed.
precisely, but with one crucial difference.
Okay.
The time as acting president is limited to a maximum of 6 months,
Okay.
during which a new president must be elected.
Right. So that ensures a swift return to a directly elected president.
Exactly.
Okay, so this temporary aspect is very different from the U.S. system,
Yes.
where the vice president's succession to the presidency is permanent
Right.
in case of a vacancy.
And they also chair the Senate, which is interesting.
Yeah, it seems like the framers of our Constitution really wanted to maintain that direct link
Yeah.
between the people and the highest office.
Absolutely reflects a commitment to those democratic principles.
Right now, what about removing a vice president from office? Is there a specific process for that.
There is, and it involves a resolution passed by an absolute majority in the Rajya Sabha,
Okay.
which then needs to be agreed upon by the Lok Sabha.
Right. But here's what's really interesting to me. The Constitution doesn't actually specify any grounds for removal.
You're right.
So theoretically, a vice president could be removed without any concrete reason.
In theory, yes.
That doesn't seem very democratic.
Well, it has certainly sparked debate and concern.
Yeah, I bet.
About the potential for misuse of this power.
Right. Imagine the political implications if a vice president was removed, based on flimsy or partisan grounds.
Yes, it's a valid point.
To clarify for our listeners,
sure.
What are the typical scenarios that would lead to a vacancy in the vice president's office in the first place?
Okay, so besides the unfortunate event of death,
right,
there's the natural end of their 5-year term. They could resign. Yeah. They could be removed through the process we just talked about.
Right.
Or they could be disqualified from holding office. Yeah. Or if their election is declared void by the Supreme Court.
Okay. Well, it's important to note that a new vice president elected to fill a vacancy serves a full 5-year term.
That's correct.
So it's not about just filling in the gap, right, but ensuring stability for whoever takes on the role.
Yes.
Now, we've talked a little bit about the U.S. vice president.
Yes, we have.
How do the powers of the Indian vice president compare to their American counterpart?
One key difference is in the perception of power.
Okay.
While the U.S. vice president has a much more active role in the executive branch, the Indian vice president is often seen as having limited real authority, which has led to the nickname.
What was the nickname?
His Superfluous Highness.
His Superfluous Highness.
Yes.
That's a bit harsh.
It is a bit harsh.
Makes you wonder if there's more to the story.
There could be.
Is it truly a ceremonial role with little influence? Or is there untapped potential for the Indian VP?
That's a good question.
All right, something for our listeners to think about.
Definitely.
We've talked about how they're elected, who's eligible, their responsibilities.
Right.
Now let's get down to the practical stuff. What kind of compensation and benefits does the vice president receive?
So this is an interesting fact.
Okay.
They don't actually receive a separate salary for being the vice president.
What?
Their compensation comes from their role as the chairman of the Rajya Sabha.
Oh, so 2 jobs, 1 salary?
Exactly.
Sounds like a pretty good deal.
I think so.
How much are we talking about?
Well, in 2008, Parliament increased the chairman of the Rajya Sabha salary to a cool 1.25 lakh per month.
Wow.
Along with a few perks as well.
Like what?
A free furnished residence, travel allowances, medical facilities, and other benefits as well.
Okay. And of course, if they're acting as president, they receive the president's salary and allowances during that time.
Correct.
Our source actually gives us a really helpful table.
It does.
It's 18.2.
Yes.
Listing all of the relevant constitutional articles that are related to the vice president.
It's like a cheat sheet.
It is a cheat sheet for our UPSC aspirants out there. All right, so now let's move on to the historical context of the vice presidency.
Sounds good. It's interesting, when you look back at the history of this position.
Yeah.
India has seen some really remarkable individuals serve as vice president.
Oh, absolutely.
Each leaving their own unique mark, I'd say.
And their contributions often go beyond just their formal duties.
Right.
We've seen vice presidents engaging in diplomacy, advocating for social causes.
Yes.
Shaping public discourse on important issues.
It's true. And, many of India's presidents actually served as vice president first.
Yeah, that's true.
It's almost like a training ground, a platform to really showcase leadership on a national stage.
So it's not just about being the next in line.
Right.
But also an opportunity to really make a difference.
Exactly.
In its own right.
Yes. And, for our UPSC aspirants out there, understanding these nuances of the vice president's role is crucial for them to really grasp the bigger picture.
Of Indian politics.
Right. Imagine being asked in the exam.
Right.
About, the constitutional provisions related to the VP's election or their powers as chairman of the Rajya Sabha.
That's right.
This is like a targeted study session.
It is.
But it's not just about exam preparation.
No.
This is important for any informed citizen.
Absolutely.
It helps us understand how power is structured in our democracy and how it's actually exercised.
Absolutely.
Now, earlier we talked about that nickname, His Superfluous Highness.
Right.
Which implies that the vice president lacks real authority.
Yes.
Why is it that some people see this role as largely ceremonial?
Well, some argue that the vice president's powers are limited compared to, like, the prime minister
Okay.
or the president.
Huh?
Their primary